There was no danger, no extraordinary danger for the general population. All this was clear from the outset. So that was the basis for the judgment to say, hey, this is not an emergency here, that's a fake emergency. And those who consider suffering from side effects of vaccinations, they should just sue the doctors that vaccinated them. No one can exempt them from their liability. The best business model, of course, is you declare a pandemic, you create the hysteria, etc., to sell your products, vaccines or whatever it may be, and being even freed of liability. So you have assured gains without taking any risk.
I have the great pleasure to be with Michael Esfeld, full professor of science of philosophy at the Lausanne University. Professor, thank you very much for taking time to answer my questions over the next 30-45 minutes. You have written many books in your career. You have written books specifically about what happened the last 3 years. We have one of these books here with the German title Und die Freiheit, which could be translated like, what about freedom? And there's another book coming out soon called Science and the Rules of Law Under Attack. What motivated you to write all these books?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And as you mentioned, I'm a professor of philosophy of science. So I'm just doing my job. Because the job of a philosopher of science is to examine claims of knowledge, whatever their source may be. And what we've seen these last 3 years was measures by governments, and they based themselves on science or on what they supposed science to be. And of course, this has to be examined critically whether there is any scientific knowledge behind all that or whether there's just a pretension of knowledge.
Let's try to walk a bit through the last 3 years. Looking back, what happened in 2020, 2021, 2022, how do you see things today when you look at it back from today?
Well, fortunately, it seems that the corona regime is behind us. Okay, so I think the United States is one of the last countries that still have restrictions for travel to the United States. So I could not go to the United States, still not because the Biden administration still imposes these so-called COVID vaccinations, although we all know that they are not vaccinations in the proper sense because they don't protect you against infection and neither do they protect others. So some of these arbitrary policies are still in place, but most of them are gone. And what we need now would be an examination. How could all this have happened? What happened? How could it happen? What were the reasons? What were the lessons to be drawn? But I think the COVID regime is behind us, which does not mean that it cannot come up again in some other form. That's indeed the risk that we face.
So the last years, when you were writing these books, how did you get your information to be sure that what you wrote about is good data? Did you have any contact with scientists? Was there any dialogue with medical doctors?
Yes, of course there was. I mean, I'm a philosopher, so I'm not searching for data myself. But there were a lot. I mean, when this COVID regime came upon us, and it came upon us quite unexpectedly, after some time, groups of critical scientists formed themselves. So I always was in touch with medical professionals, professors of epidemiology and other branches of medicine who checked what I wrote. But I did not write anything myself. I have no medical competence. As a philosopher of science, I can read and analyze statistics. Mm-hmm. And this is most about statistics. Mm-hmm. So to take just one clear example, if you do certain political measures, after a certain time, you can evaluate them. So to put it very bluntly, if lockdowns worked, we should have seen in those countries that imposed lockdowns much less infection rates, fatality rates from the coronavirus than in the countries that did not. So, for instance, in the United States, South Dakota didn't do nothing Florida quickly changed back, abandoned this, whereas New York or California continued for a long time. So you should see some difference. New York and California should have fared much better than, say, South Dakota or Florida, and they didn't. You see the same in Europe. Sweden did nearly nothing. Germany did a lot. France was even worse. Switzerland was a little better, but there's no correlation between the measures and faring any better. It's just it seems that those countries who impose these strict measures, they have all the damages, okay? So these are things the philosopher can analyze. You don't need any medical knowledge for that.
Well, did you have, nevertheless, dialogue with medical doctors about what they observed in the field?
Yes, of course. Yeah, but of course not with all of them. I mean, many people just refused the dialogue. So what I said, the most people I was in touch with had a critical attitude. And many other people just refused to discuss, in the sense that they said, look, your arguments may be all right from a philosophical point of view, but now we have an emergency. Now it's not the time to discuss. Now we have to act. But the point at issue just is whether we have a real emergency or a fake one. And this we have to examine in any case.
So you examined that question?
Yes.
And what was your conclusion?
Well, that it was fake, because we never had any factual evidence that there was something extraordinary or something dangerous for the general population going on. I mean, we had virus waves before. We had the Hong Kong flu at the end of the 60s, the Asian flu in the middle of the 50s or so. So this coronavirus waves may have been worse than say, seasonary flu. Of course, it seems that they were, but they were not extraordinary. So we had cases to compare them to. And we have this is also a methodological problem, that you have evidence-based medicine, where you look into the actual evidence, and you have people who do models. And these predictions of an emergency, of something extraordinary happening, were all based on models. But of course, in philosophy of science, we all know that models have their use as describing possible features, possible evolutions of the system under consideration, but they are not representations of reality, and they are not predictions about what is going to happen, because to do a model, you have to choose certain parameters. You put weight on certain parameters and you neglect other one, but that may be wrong. You don't know from the outset what are the relevant parameters. So, for instance, in a virus wave, of course, one relevant parameter is how people will adapt. So people are not just physical objects. If I give you the information that there's some virus waves coming and you're not quite sure how dangerous this is, of course you will be more cautious. You will adapt your behavior. Okay, so how do you model that? And then the usual models did not take into account human reactions at all. They presumed that humans were like physical objects, and then their emotions have to be controlled from the outset. Okay. Then you have, for the variables you consider, you have to set initial values. And if you set them in a rather high manner, so if you assume that the infection fatality rate is very high, then of course you get catastrophic predictions. But if you assume that it is lower, you don't get any catastrophic predictions, and you don't know from the outset. So there's an issue here between basing science on evidence versus basing science on models. And if you look at the evidence, so already in March 2020, there was some evidence. So all the passengers on one of these chips had been tested, Princess Diamond or so. So you could make a John Ioannidis did it. On the basis of the results, you could make some overall estimations. And it was clear from the outset that the infection fatality rate will in any case be far below 1%. So that's not a catastrophe. Then we had in Germany, we had this case of Heinsberg, where a whole village was tested, and this was also in April, May 2020, and the result was infection fatality rate somehow between 0.3 and 0.4%, which proved quite correct. And then we saw it was increasing with the age. So for all people under 60, there was no considerable risk. I mean, if you drive on a motorcycle, that's quite dangerous. If you go hiking in Swiss mountains, that's also quite dangerous. I mean, but people do, and no one would think of locking them in or forbidding them to go hiking in the mountains. So this risk for everybody under 60, 70 was comparable to everyday risk people take, or when they drive to work, when they drive in a car, say 1 hour per day or so, there's a certain risk of having an accident. And well, that was in that range, so nothing extraordinary. And then you saw when people, the older they get, of course, the immunitary systems get weaker, etc., the more vulnerable they are. So that was a clear profile which corresponds to other epidemiologies epidemics we have seen. And it's clear that then special protection should be offered for those who are vulnerable, but there was no danger, no extraordinary danger for the general population. All this was clear from the outset. So that was the base for the judgment to say, hey, this is not an emergency here. That's a fake emergency.
So how do you explain that the computer models became that important suddenly in 2020?
Take another example. Suppose you inherited $1 million or so, and now you want to invest them. And now you want to invest them, say you want to invest them in the stock market. And now you want to know something about the future evolution of the stock market or of the stocks you are interested in. Of course, that's not possible. But the bank will offer you all sorts of models that make all sorts of prediction. I mean, they do every year, and they predict at the beginning of the year how at the end of the year, say, the S&P 500 will evolve or so. And we all know that these predictions have no value. I mean, if you look back, the track record of getting it right is poor. And if someone got it right, it's not because they have some knowledge, but because of pure chance. But nevertheless, there's a demand. So you want to, you cannot live with uncertainty in the future. So you want some certainty. And that's how banks develop sophisticated models to predict the values of the future values of financial instruments like stocks or currency pairs or bonds or precious metals or what have you, or commodities. But they really can't. I mean, you can make, of course, some qualitative statements, say if the economy in the United States goes into recession, that will not be good for stocks or something like that. But to make a model that gives you precise predictions is rather serving a psychological need than something scientific. It's the same here. So it's a psychological need that something, there are always new challenges, and you give the false impression as if science could master them. And then, of course, if you're a scientist and if you say, okay, my model predicts that nothing extraordinary will happen, then politicians, media will say thank you, but they won't be interested anymore in you. But if you tell them that the world is going to end in a couple of months, or that there will be millions of deaths, etc., then you are in the media. So with predictions that everything is all right, well, okay, then business goes on, no one is interested in you. It's the same when you have, again, the stock market. You always find some gurus who tell you that either you'll get very rich or that the stock markets will crash, etc., and then they are in the media. And sometimes it really crashed, so in 2008 or so, and then these people became famous for allegedly having predicted that it will crash. But of course, someone always predicts that something will crash. But it's more interesting. So we know from other areas, that what I want to say, that the pessimistic prediction is the interesting one. And then someone comes and offers you protection or things like that. But for this business to run, you first have to make a pessimistic prediction, then offer the protection, and then you're in the business, you're in the media.
So you basically are partially saying that the attention goes there where the negativity is.
Yes.
And that's very fear-related, basically.
Yes, of course. I mean, there always is danger. And you want to protect yourself. That's why you have insurances. You have health insurances, you have insurances for civil liability, you have insurances for retirement, etc. And they all have good sense. So the future is uncertain, There are always challenges, there are risks, etc. And you somehow want to get some security and some insurance how to prevent falling victim to negative effects. So that's human and that's completely all right. But you can make a business out of it by predicting all sorts of evil things. And of course, it is true that the probability of such things to happen is not zero. So it may be that there's a very dangerous virus coming. It may be that some catastrophe or other is going to happen. But the problem now is if you focus all your action to prevent a catastrophe that may happen, which does not have zero probability, this has costs. You have to make efforts, and this will you cannot use the means that you employ to protect yourself for other things, and this is damages, and that's what we have seen. So if you think that under no circumstances anyone must get infected with the coronavirus, you have to impose a strict lockdown, and of course this will cause casualties if you lock people in. I mean, it won't be able to organize all the food for them, so they may just starve to death, they may die of old age, they may die of social isolation, they may die of failure of health care. So if you have a heart attack and you're in lockdown and you're, like in China, really locked in, they won't be there in time to get you out of your house and bring you to hospital, etc. And we have seen all this. So the point is you always have to act under uncertainty, and you always, anything you do has a certain cost, has certain negative effects. And that's why you need this criterion of what in German is called Verhältnismäßigkeit, what is called proportionality in English, or what in philosophy is called faculty of judgment. So judging, assessing, putting into context, into a frame what is going on in order to have a response which is appropriate, considering all things and not just focusing on one possible risk.
So we can summarize that the computer models did not reflect reality.
Yes.
And how do you see the role of the media, and how did the media amplify basically the negative narrative of the corona crisis?
If a dog bites a man, that wouldn't be a story in the media. Okay, that happens every day. But if a man bites a dog, there would be a story in the media. Okay, so you need something exciting, something extraordinary, something shocking people, something calling people's attention. So if you say life is going on well, then the positive news, no one will read them. So we had a huge decrease, a huge success. I mean, you know much more about that than I do, about Africa and poverty. But this was not reported. It was slow, but it was a big success. But if you get something negative, you make headlines, you're in the media, so that this gets a machinery that's fueling itself. So look at politicians. So somehow the idea came up that if someone dies of the coronavirus, the politicians are responsible. So you know that in the United Kingdom, the National Health Service, because it is state-run, does not function well, okay? And the Conservatives in government did not much do about it, and they are in government for about 10 years or so. So they could say, okay, so if someone dies of the coronavirus, so it's the fault of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, because he neglected the National Health Service, and he's responsible for the death of that person. Now, what's the reaction of Boris Johnson? Okay, he has to prevent, he has to lock people in, etc., but no media should be able to accuse him to being responsible. If they die then from the lockdown, it doesn't matter. I mean, he did everything to protect them. If they die nevertheless of other causes, and of course also of the coronavirus, doesn't matter, he did act. I mean, he acted just for the sake of acting. So you see that's a machinery which drives itself. So a negative headline, then you need the politician, then you ask the politician, what shall we do about it? And the honest response of the politician should be, or the honest response also of the media and the public should be, come on, how could a politician manage a virus waves? they could manage and they should manage infrastructure. But look at how infrastructure is poor in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Europe, and in continental Europe, more or less everywhere. I mean, they cannot even manage infrastructure, roads, rail lines, electricity, and things like that. How could you expect them to manage a virus wave? Okay, so they better should abstain. That should be the natural reaction, because already there, where they have tasks and where they could do something, they are not quite efficient at doing so. Or you know how in every country the bureaucracy is. I mean, they sometimes work well. The people, I mean, the employees are certainly well motivated, but I mean, you wouldn't call that system efficient. So how can you expect them now to manage such a crisis? They should better abstain and do nothing, because we know that they usually don't do it well.
You mentioned the politicians and their incapability to manage epidemics and infrastructure and resources in general, but these politicians have been advised by scientists. So what about the role of these scientists who have been close to the politicians so that they can make decisions? I read the introduction of your book, which is going to come out soon, which I mentioned just recently, Science and the Rule of Law Under Attack. And you write something very interesting in the introduction. You write about that there is a tight link between modern science and democracy. Can you elaborate on that?
I mean, historically, both of them emerged in the early modern ages. I mean, after the religious wars. So we had in Europe, in continental Europe, in the 16th and 17th century, these horrible religious wars, which were causing a lot of casualties, and hygiene was down, the Black Death came, etc. And then it was realized it's better to separate the state from religion and to separate science from religious influence. So both science and politics freed themselves from religious influence for the good. And both of them are, if you look a bit deeper, both of them are attempts to employ reason to limit power. So in science, you need evidence and arguments. Authority has no place in science. I mean, although it should not have a place, I should say, although it de facto has, but it does not matter in science. I mean, a first-year student can ask a very good question, can make an objection, challenge a professor. And it is not whether that's a first-year student or another distinguished professor, it doesn't matter. The quality of the argument matters. The same, so it's reason limiting exercise of power by people who are in more influential positions. The same then in the modern state. You have the system of division of power, the system like in the United States Constitution of checks and balances, etc., to employ reason to limit the power of the state. So that's I would say that's characteristic of the modern epoch after this experience of the religious war, employ reason to limit the exercise of power and recognize in the state the rule of law as the rule based on same law for all, and that again means recognition of human rights for all. So it's not that certain people, noblemen or clergymen, have special rights and other people have less rights. Everybody has the same right to live a self-determined life to the extent that they respect the right of everybody else to do so.
So in your book, Science and the Rule of Law Under Attack, you point out this importance between science and democracy, but obviously, as you perfectly explained, the crisis hasn't been that bad as it has been pointed out in the media and pointed out by the politicians. So what's going on in our society?
I mean, in any case, it hasn't been an emergency which justifies suspending the rule of law and justifies suspending the normal critical process in science of checking arguments and evidence. And that's the danger, that this has been turned upside down. And we've seen science assuming again the role that religion had in pre-modern times. And in technical vocabulary, this is called scientism. So scientism is the idea that science does not discover only facts, but that science somehow in discovering facts is also capable of imposing norms, is also capable of telling people what to do. So the slogan, follow the science, is an expression of scientism. But of course, this is complete rubbish. And anyone who says that you should follow the science has not understood anything at all about science, even if they may otherwise be scientists or so. They have understood nothing at all about science, because science is about matters of fact. And facts cannot imply norms. And science is objective, which means that science has to abstract from all subjective values and judgments. So everything that concerns subjectivity in the sense of thought, intentions for actions, what shall I do, etc., is not a business of science, and cannot in principle be a business of science. Because again, the role of science in the modern society is to provide, to give us information, but not to tell us what to do. And science can play this role only and can have its respect and reputation only on the basis that it gives objective information, that whatever your political views are, whatever your moral values are, whatever your religion is, etc., you can accept. So, in the United States, there are many differences between Democrats and Republicans, but the science should be the same. Okay, so the science should not be partisan. Unfortunately, it is, or large parts of it are. But when they become a political party, when they go into values, etc., when they become like a quasi-religion, they cannot no longer be expected to be respected by all members of the public, because then those who follow that science will take that to be science, and others will opt out of it. So this will backfire against science. It will imply that science loses the objectivity that it claims and that it maintained for many centuries against all sorts of attempts to influence it. So I think that science is about to destroy itself, to put it bluntly and clearly.
You're saying that science lost credibility?
Yes, of course. I mean, you see what has been sold as science as pseudoscience. In these models, so to take a concrete example, this model by Ferguson and collaborators from Imperial College London, middle of March 2020, it makes all the mistakes of political scientism. So the first mistake was to completely neglect the important parameter that I already mentioned, namely that humans will adapt their behavior when they get new information. So the model neglected that. So already that, Popper pointed this out, Hayek pointed this out in the 40s in their discussion in the LSE, the London School of Economics, about scientific methodology, that when you go to human and social sciences, when human beings come in, the most important variable is how they evaluate the situation and how they adapt the new situation. So this was a mistake. Then they exaggerated, hugely exaggerated the initial values of infection fatality rate and the deaths in intensive care units, etc. And then they came to these catastrophic predictions. But if that is science, of course, nothing of these predictions came out. So the countries who did not go into lockdown, like Sweden, according to the Ferguson model, they would have seen tens of thousands of deaths, but they saw nothing of that. And if this is science, of course, people will say, well, that is not science. That's nothing we will accept. That's just,
Well, let's just take this element of adaptation of human beings. When they're in a stressful situation, they adapt to the circumstances as good as they can on an individual level, on a collective level. Do you think this ignorance of this element has been something which happened intentionally, or has it to do with the mindset of the decision makers?
It has to do with the mindset of the decision makers. There's this scientism is quite seductive, okay? So there is, there are always many sides to one of these things. So it's not just a bunch of scientists who are the culprits. There's this psychological need for security. There's also the psychological need for something like religion. I mean, religion has lost its position as something that unites society. So there is something that could replace religion. Of course, science cannot fulfill this role, but it's seductive for scientists because of the success that science had in improving the conditions of life, to say, okay, science can bring all risks under control. You just have to follow the science and things like that. And that's, of course, the danger where it turns against science itself. But there's a certain seduction, and scientism was always, I mean, all throughout the whole modern epoch, there were people who thought that science is there to give norms and to act as something like a moral guide to life. But usually they were kept under control by other scientists saying, come on, what's the evidence? What's the argument that you have? And this control was suppressed in this situation, I think, for quite contingent circumstances. So look back, we had this flu influenza epidemic. You know, there's something like around 2009, or the swine flu.
2009,
yeah. Okay, so there they were stopped. I mean, it was the same people, Fauci, Ferguson, Drosten, who made catastrophic predictions at that time, but other scientists said, come on, this is not science what you're doing. And the thing was stopped in due course.
I'd like to mention at this point an article in one of the regional newspapers where you have been portrayed. I can show the article. And I read the article in detail. I was surprised about the way it has been put, because obviously there was an intention to discredit you.
Yes, obviously. I mean, if you show the headline. So I was supposed, it says here that I'm a rebellious professor who embarrasses the University of Lausanne, who puts shame on the University of Lausanne. And why did I do it? Because I would say I did my job. I mean, the job of a philosopher of science, as I said at the beginning, is to examine pretensions of knowledge.
Yeah. How do you explain?
So how can that be?
Yeah, how can that be? Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, how can that be that is embarrassing? So some people were behind this, even if they may be in science, they apparently have understood nothing at all of science and are misplaced there.
Yeah.
I mean, science is about debate and about evidence and argument. And anyone who cannot stand this, even if they are medical practitioners or whatever they be, they have nothing to do in science. And I would say also they have nothing to do in a modern society. They should undergo psychotherapy or something. They should learn to respect other people, the views of other people. I'm sorry to be rather hard here, but it is so. If someone is not able to answer a critical question, to tolerate that they have to give argument and evidence for what they say, they, of course, as citizens, they are as human beings, no one can prescribe to them, but they should not have any public position. They are misplaced in an open society for any public office.
Yeah, well, you have been one of the academics, let's say, being crucified in the media for taking position. Now we have had medical doctors to whom the same happened, and I think once some of the colleagues saw that, they got so terrified and terrorized by what's going on that they prefer not to say anything.
Yes, that's of course the intention. I mean, it is presented in the media as if there were a scientific consensus, but of course there is none. So every scientist who speaks out in the public against that alleged consensus has to be portrayed as fringe, as somehow not belonging to science, to prevent others from speaking out. Because if you, I mean, we will, even with all this propaganda, even with all these financial bribery, I would say, in the sense of COVID aids, which were given by state, funded by state debts, the debt increase of debt, we had this vote in Switzerland where 40% voted against the COVID law. So in the population, even with all the propaganda, it was something like 60 to 40%. And there's not much difference in science, I would say. It's not just a small minority. and they know it. So you have to try to silence people, because if all the scientists who have doubts were to speak out, the whole thing would be finished. They could not be ignored. And that's, of course, the mechanism. So I don't take this as a personal attack. I guess no one has, they don't know me even as a person, I guess. So no one has any objections to me as a person. I mean, some people may have, but that's not the issue here. The issue here is that if they tolerate that people ask critical questions, this whole regime of follow the science will be finished, because then the public would realize that is not the science.
Have you been surprised about how the mainstream media has been aligned on the official narrative, and those speaking out against the official narrative, the intensity, the way they have, about the intensity they have been crucified?
Yes, I mean, this is one aspect of the whole regime. I never expected that something like that could happen here. I mean, we saw it in China in December 2019 that people were locked in. But of course, we know that China is a totalitarian state. So I never thought that that could happen here, because we have an open society, so there would be debate, etc. And you cannot lock in people in Europe or the United States. But nevertheless, it happened. So I was wrong. And then we have to go into the reason why I and many other people were wrong, why that could happen.
So we can conclude that there was huge collective intimidation.
Yes, but I mean, there are always two sides. There are those who intimidate, and there are those who let themselves intimidate. So, as I mentioned before, somehow this is a huge failure of judgment. There never was any evidence that it was something, a truly dangerous situation for the entire population, or that there was something like emergency here. So we have in many people and many academics, politicians, etc., a loss of judgment, that they fall victim to this. And then we have some people who drive this because they are something like religious fanatics who see the end of the world everywhere. So you see a pandemic coming up all the time, but usually they are stopped. So there are a number of contingent reasons why did this not happen this time. So there's the scientism, and scientism is of course very seductive. So it tells scientists, you really have a mission for society. You really have to. I heard many scientists say, but look, if we practice laissez-faire, let the people adapt themselves, they can't do it. They can't act responsibility. We have to tell them that they have to wash their hands, that they have to wear masks, that they have to keep distance, etc. But who are we scientists? Who are these scientists that we have to tell them? What arrogance is this to suppose that ordinary people don't know, cannot manage their life without guidance by scientists? But of course it is sectistic. So now we scientists, we have to tell the people what to do. And of course many jump on this train. Okay, we have to tell the people how to do. So I develop a model how wearing masks will reduce the spread of the virus, etc. I jump. You want to be part of the trend. So once a trend is there, it's very seductive. You want to be part of it. You want to be, that's the good now, that's the good people. Of course, you want to be part of the good people, and your behavior is exemplary, you're responsible, etc. and all this. And this once this train gets running, it's very difficult to stop it. Mm-hmm. Because it takes many people with them, and they realize only later then, when they see the damages that all this has caused, how it goes. So there are many parallels from history. So think about the First World War. I mean, in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Europe was quite developed. There was tourism. There was no longer this hardship that we had at the beginning of the 19th century when the industrialization started. There were trade unions. Trade unions negotiated better working conditions, etc. So it looked, everything on the surface looked like quite going well. And you would not think that a new war could break out among the European countries. But beneath all this, you had this nationalism. And it coming up with the nation states that had formed in Europe. And in Eastern Europe, then it exploded because it was difficult to build up nation states there, like France or Germany, or to a certain extent, the United Kingdom. And then out of a sudden, there was a war. And then when the war came, then people were participating. They were even enthusiastic about it. This was also a trend. So you had Germans going down the streets and singing, okay, we fight England now. We get seen gegen England. We will march, we'll fight England, we'll fight France, etc. And of course, this ended into a huge catastrophe. But there was this trend to be part of it. And think of those who were opposed to war. I mean, either they were silenced or they also jumped on the train. So one example is take just one example, Walter Rathenau, who was a German industrialist and later on politician. Of course, he was against the war. But once the war started, I mean, of course, he tried, okay, then I have to do my best now that Germany wins the war. So he participated. And then after the war, he tried to negotiate a peace and he was murdered for that. But many people who were by no means people who were in favor of a war or so, then nevertheless somehow participated, were taken. So it was very difficult. So you could see that, you could study. There are many examples of that in history where some sort of a mass hysteria developed and the roots were already there, but then it broke out like out of a sudden. But when it was there, it was very difficult to stop it. And something like this happened as well. So there are many roots why this Corona regime could happen in 2020. You see them, but when it came like a trend that was difficult to resist. And I mean, this is the eternal job now to see what can we do to prevent this from coming up again.
So you're basically saying that the mechanisms and mechanics behind are not new. We've had that in the past.
Yes. And we always had, I mean, we always tried that we had left that behind. So after the Second World War, nationalism was left behind. You thought that was finished, but somehow it came up now as this somehow health and hygiene idea with this pandemic again. And the problem is that you will always have people who, for whatever reasons, you'll always have some religious fanatics who go into science because they think that they were better off and some of this religious movement, or put it better, because these are not Christian. I mean, it's not really Christian, say superstitious movements, but they go into science because this gives them more power. Many people are driven into politics because this gives them powers. Many people in economics, pharmaceutical industry, etc., other industries have economic interest. You can't prevent this. But what we had, and this is the link again with the rule of law, was that we thought we had enough mechanisms built into our political system that would prevent them. And the shocking thing to see is that all of them failed. The whole judiciary failed. The whole system of checks and balances failed, etc. So what we need to do now is to prevent that there is a state power that can lock us in, so to speak. So we have to see that we cannot change the people. So there will always be people, but there shouldn't be a concentration of power that enabled, say, scientists to seize the media and the politicians, etc. So there must be clear limits into what, to my mind, the laws about epidemics or so. This is the whole issue of health care, etc. It's not an issue where the state should mingle in. The whole economic issue, etc. Think of just one example. Think of these so-called COVID vaccines. Okay, now suppose we had these virus waves. Of course, some pharmaceutical company would develop vaccines. But if we had a free society, then they would have to persuade people to take these vaccines. They could not seize the state power such that the state power enforces the vaccines on the people and exempts their producers from any liability. They are not even liable for the damages caused. The contracts and the conditions under which they were bought by governments, they are not made public, although all this is financed by the public, etc. So this must not be. Of course, they can offer whatever they want as medical treatments, but then they have to convince people and take liability. So I think that the best thing we can do is to prevent that there's a concentration of power in the hand of the state, that these various interest groups can cease to further their interests.
You mentioned the vaccines, and I thought a lot about the standards we have had in modern medicine, and as the vaccines have still been used in an experimental phase, actually, one of the standards of modern medicine is when we don't know about the long-term or short-term side effects of a product, that we ask the people who get the product to sign a written consent. And it is, unfortunately, this has not been done systematically, or it was a rather the exception that people have had the opportunities to sit down with a medical professional who explains them, what do we know about these products, what do we not know about the products, what might happen immediately, what might maybe happen at some point later. There are so many question marks about it. Can we talk about the standards in modern medicine we have had so far? And I believe we have unfortunately walked away.
Yeah, I mean, those who consider suffering from side effects of vaccinations, they should just sue the doctors they vaccinated them. No one can exempt them from their liability. Come again back to the comparison with financial markets. So you inherit your $1 million, you go to your bank, and the bank tells you should invest in, I don't know enough about it. You should invest in some particular shares, okay? And then these shares go down, you lost your fortune. I mean, you can sue your bank if they did not explain you the risk. And that's clear, that's common standard. If the bank advises you or tells you or suggests that you should invest in some particular stocks without, or whatever it may be, or bonds or commodities, whatever, if they give you counsel, advice in investing, they are responsible for explaining the risks to you. And if they don't if they just take your money and invest it without explaining it, and you lose your money, it's normal. No one would object to suing them. And you won't sue the politicians or whatever, you would sue the bankers. No, the same here. If a doctor or if some medical professional, I mean, the doctor, applies a medical treatment to you without explaining to you the risks, and then you suffer side effects from that, negative effects on your health, well, obviously you sue them. And they cannot, I mean, even if this was recommended or whatever, they are responsible. So one example, we had these mask mandates in the university. And I always had some students in my classes who didn't wear a mask. But I would never impose them to wear a mask for a very simple reason. I know, of course, the rule, and I can repeat the rule that by some order of the university president, everybody has to wear a mask. But when I teach my course and someone tells me they feel sick if they wear a mask, and if I now tell them, force them to wear a mask, then I'm responsible for judging this case. Whatever orders there may be from politicians or the university president or the dean or whoever it may be, I have to apply faculty of judgment in judging the individual case. Now, I have no medical knowledge. I cannot judge. So if I were to impose wearing a mask on the student and say the student collapses or faints or so, of course they can sue me, because I gave them, in this case, the order, and I didn't realize that this rule does not apply to them because and I cannot judge. So I said, I'm sorry, I can't judge this. I mean, they may call in some medical professional to examine the case, etc., but I won't do it, although I respect the rules myself. That was not the issue. I mean, I have to respect the rules, whatever I think about them. But I cannot, I'm responsible in the individual situation as a teacher if I impose something on my students. And it's the same in every situation. So the thing is very clear. And that's what any totalitarian regime tries to somehow to exclude, I mean, the human element, to think that the humans are machines, they just execute orders. No, they don't. They are to judge the situation they are confronted with. And no one can take this responsibility away from them. So if in totalitarian governments they said, well, they had to shoot these people because they had the order, no, they hadn't. They could have said, well, in this case, I mean, we cannot call into question the Hitler regime and all these human rights violations ordered from above. But when we execute or take the Berlin Wall, when the soldier shoots on someone trying to flee this so-called the Soviet occupation zone, there was no state, it just was the Soviet occupation zone. If someone tries to flee from them, the soldier who shoots at them, of course, is responsible for his action. He could not have resisted the order in the general case, but he could have say, under these circumstances, it was not possible for me to shoot at them. And if someone else did, of course, they cannot prevent this. But you, as a human being, you always bear the individual responsibility for the way in which you apply rules, even unjust rules. So you cannot delegate the responsibility to those who issued these unjust rules. You still have your own responsibility. And that may be very difficult in situations. And of course, there are situations in which you are exempt from any legal guilt, etc. That's not the issue here. But the point here is that you have your individual responsibility. So that should be clear. And of course, this also means that if people assume their individual responsibility, such a regime will collapse.
So you say the victims, those who have got side effects of after getting the vaccines, should sue the doctors. Now, very often these have not been doctors who did the injections.
Yeah, they should sue them who applied this.
So you've had these vaccination centers, as you know, yes. And it will be very difficult to find out who vaccinated whom.
I mean, there's someone running the center, someone responsible for, I mean, they have to, I mean, by law. So take the same again with investments. Now you invest your money and lose your money because there was a robot giving the advice. Well, someone programmed the robot. So, I mean, you may have consented to this. You may have consented to saying, okay, I invest the $1 million that I inherited according to the recommendations given by this machine and algorithm, knowing the risk, etc. That's all right. That's your choice. I mean, but if you just are subject to this, then of course there's someone responsible for having programmed or having one set up a bank. There's some manager of the bank. So if there's a vaccine center and there is someone running the center, so that person has to make sure that everybody who gets vaccinated in their center has consented and has been and the risks have been explained to them. So there always is some person who is responsible, and it's not the politician or someone who gave the order above. It's someone who applied this in the concrete case. So there's someone running these vaccination centers if they make.
So the fact that we don't have written consents is putting those who did do the jest and inject something into a very difficult place.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned science and scientism, and I mentioned the standards we have in modern medicine. I want to talk a little bit about the PCR test, because the PCR test for me is an example of scientism, where we suddenly have got cases, but not necessarily sick people.
Yes, exactly. So now as I said, I'm not a medical professional, so I cannot say anything about the details of the PCR test. But the issue is that to declare someone sick, you need more than just one test. So it's against all standards to judge something just on the basis of one test. And we know, I mean, Paul Kahn and his team in Münster in Germany, they evaluated some 160,000 tests, and they found that about 60%, so more than half of them, were false positive. I mean, the people had no symptoms, and they could, under reasonable circumstances, not transmit the virus. So that can't be the it cannot be that you establish the diagnosis. So I also had one positive test once, but I didn't suffer from a respiratory illness. I had some other health problem. They did a test and then declared me positive, and then they gave me a certificate, genesen, do they say, so recovered from. But it was, of course, all fake because I never had I didn't have a respiratory illness to start with, so I could not have recovered from that. I may have had some other problem, but for sure not that one. So you need, the PCR test can be very useful as part of a diagnosis, but it cannot establish a diagnosis. So it's against all standards of medicine and against all standards of science. If I have just one piece of evidence, I can never make a conclusion. The evidence one piece of evidence always has to be confirmed by other pieces of evidence that are independent of it. So if someone has certain symptoms and now the medical doctor is not sure what illness they have, then of course you perform tests to narrow down what the illness is. And as far as I understand this whole coronavirus, they are not specific symptoms. It's like other respiratory diseases. So it's not a new natural kind of a disease. It's just what we know, and that it may be heavier, etc. But this whole, this goes back more to philosophy. This whole thing is also about language and changing the meanings of concepts. So to start with, a pandemic no longer means excess mortality, because there was no excess mortality in countries like Switzerland, Germany, Sweden in 2020. So it just means infections, okay? So you have a pandemic just because people are infected. So infection now does not mean that they are actually sick, that they have symptoms of illness. It just means that they show a positive result of a test. So it's completely arbitrary. So I call this post-factual, okay? So somehow, in some contexts, some people are accused of no longer sticking to facts and being post-factual. Now, this is a whole post-factual thing because there are no facts in there. I mean, when you look at the facts, this all fades away. So where are the facts of of course, people have been infected, but not because they had a positive test. I mean, if they had symptoms, etc., and people got seriously ill, people died, etc. That's all true, but it cannot be just the declaration of a positive test results that establishes this.
I mentioned the PCR test because I didn't know very much about PCR tests, and I think it's a good example of how media, science, scientism, politics are intermingled, because it was one of the driving forces in the media of creating fear and anxiety, because the higher the numbers were, the more people were anxious, and I could see that every day at work.
Yes, I mean, they reported every day these figures in the media, but they were meaningless. I mean, in our countries, the death statistics are well done. So if someone is declared dead, they are usually dead, and all the deaths are registered, and there's no fake in there. So you would have to look for excess mortality. If you see significant excess mortality, so more, of course, mortality is not the same all the time, but it's going up and down, etc. But if you see, wow, it peaks, then you know something extraordinary is going on. But if you don't see such a peaking, something out of the ordinary, then nothing extraordinary is going on, whatever you may declare. So you may declare even people who had been murdered or who died as a result of a car accident were declared corona deaths because they had a positive test. So this does not say anything about the cause, about there being any new factor causing mortality, because then you would have to see excess mortality. Now, in some countries you saw excess mortality, in the United States, for instance, and in other countries you didn't, although the virus was more or less everywhere. So even there where you had excess mortality, it can't be just the virus as such that is the causes. There are other factors. So the issue is more complicated than just looking at these numbers, because they are not the relevant numbers. The relevant numbers would be excess deaths all over the population, all over the countries that have been affected by these virus waves, and there was no such thing.
I want to come back to the question of mindset. You mentioned at the first part of the interview the Fergusons, the Faucis, and so on, who come up with a very limited representation of reality.
Yeah.
And that, at the end, translates into computer models who not representative, but basically can become the driving force of a narrative that then itself translates into certain decision-making in politics. Now, if we have this kind of mindset where we see the disease in human beings as a very, in a very limited way, don't we need to rethink the whole educational system and also medical studies itself?
I don't know, because I mean there's something in favor of what you say, because there are deep racines to what is going on, so deep roots, and we have to really get down to them. But on the other hand, as we just mentioned before, all the existing standards of medicine and science were thrown overboard. So if this then suggests that there's nothing wrong with science as it was done up to now as such, but we have to look, why were these standards thrown overboard? And then with modern science as such, there's nothing wrong with it. So this goes back to Descartes, among other people, who had this this idea of the physical world consisting in matter and motion. So we have to find out the laws of motion in order to be able to intervene to get the motions that we want, etc. That's all right. And Descartes was also clear about it. In order to gain objective knowledge, we need this methodological, disciplined skepticism, etc. So all the methods. So in the first place, I would say all the methods, all the established methods of science were not respected in this case. Now the question, why was that so? That gets us back. Is there anything in science that is wrong in itself? I would say no. The thing is, when you think that this science is somehow a replacement for religion, that it is somehow a moral guide, that it's somehow, or to take medicine again, that it is not just about the body and studying how you can influence certain bodily emotions by giving, say, antibiotics to some people, but you also cover the whole human being, so that this method of science is able to study human emotions, human consciousness, human thought, human action. Then it goes wrong for the very simple reason, or also mentioned before, that now subjectivity becomes the most important parameter, and that science, abstracting from all subjective things. Again, just read Descartes, how to see how science has to abstract from all subjective things. Of course, can't cover that aspect of subjectivity, which becomes crucial then. Well, in medicine, you're somehow at the borderline. So if you think of the human body just like a machine, of course you get it wrong. And I can't judge this. Perhaps there was something going wrong in medicine, but I would not say in science in general, apart from this scientific seduction of taking science like a moral guide and a religion.
Mm-hmm. I understand what you're saying. For me, as a medical professional, as a medical doctor, I do not consider myself as a scientist. I'm somebody who has got some scientific training, but at the end, almost everything I learned through the patient and human interaction. So, okay, I do medical studies at medical school, and of course with biochemistry and physics and chemistry, etc., etc. But the art of medicine and becoming a good practitioner at the end has very much to do with experience and, of course, as well, motivation to study and so on. But it is the experience with the patient which makes the difference. So the question I've asked myself is, what happened to the medical profession that we could not organize ourselves sufficiently to make clear what's towards the politicians or decision makers to create a representative picture about what's really going on in the field? Because what you said at the very beginning is what every medical practitioner would come to as a conclusion, that at the end this wasn't that bad.
Yeah, but I mean, the people listen to academics in university. They never had contact with patients, I guess, or they never treated patients. They made models and so on. So that's also an issue, and well, the professional bodies of medical practitioners, like all these professional bodies, they were influenced by politics. They failed. I would say. I think the medicine at the root, and then these were just taken. I mean, those who vaccinated on a chain and without informing people about the risk or so. Yeah, they were taken in this mass hysteria. But usually, any medical professional, any practitioner, any GP would agree with what you just said.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that the medical boards have been influenced by politics?
I mean, the whole health business is highly regulated by politics under the influence of pharmaceutical industry. And of course, pharmaceutical industry runs by declaring people being sick, even if they are not sick at all. So the best business model, of course, is you declare a pandemic, you create the hysteria, etc., to sell your products, vaccines or whatever it may be, and being even freed of liability. So you have assured gains without taking any risk. So, I mean, everybody knows this as well, that there's an influence of regulation by politicians who are themselves under influence of pharmaceutical industry. More or less every day you read about something that should be scandalous, so that someone more or less got funding from some pharmaceutical company, and of course the interest is clear. Or I recently read that the husband of Ursula von der Leyen, who is the president of the Commission of the European Union, got offered a job by some pharmaceutical company in the United States. Well, that's evident what's going on there.
Mm-hmm. I thank you very much for the conversation, which I enjoyed very much. I hope that we're going to have an opportunity again to exchange a bit more. It has been extremely rich. I see all your books you have written. I'm definitely going to buy a few ones, try to read them and study them. I think for me as a medical doctor, where I see patients actually every day since almost 20 years, I'm inspired by the patients, and I have a lot of questions. Some of them are of philosophical nature. And to conclude, I think that what happened the last 3 years has been extremely revealing, and I've learned so much from a human nature level about human beings. And I think that we have to rethink ethics in science and in politics and in medicine. And I think this needs dialogue, and we need experts in their fields like you. And I hope that as much people as possible are going to benefit from our conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.